The Jewish presence in Fort Worth is part of the enormously complex mosaic of Jewish life in America, which began in 1654 with the arrival of a small contingent to New Amsterdam, trickled for nearly 200 years, and then swelled to an overwhelming tide during the 19th century. This brief presentation cannot examine all the cross-currents, religious, political, economic, and social, as well as the diverse origins of Jews who arrived in America. Instead, it will focus on the small part of the larger mosaic represented by the Jews of Fort Worth. In examining the history of some of the earliest Jewish families in the city, the viewer may also gain an understanding of the broader picture of not only why Jews are in America, but how they've been an integral part of this country's development. Although there were significant Jewish communities in the East and Midwest by the 1850s, it was only around this time that Jews began migrating to the Southwest. Among the first of these was Simon Gabbert. After a time in Fort Worth in the late 1850s, Gabbert went to California in search of gold, later fought in the Union Army, and returned to Fort Worth in 1880, was a successful cotton buyer, and played the cotton commodities market. He was buried in Hebrew Rest Cemetery in 1911. Jacob Samuels, seated at left in this picture, came to Fort Worth from Louisiana with his father before the Civil War, in which he fought as a Confederate soldier. Returning home, he married Bertha Waddell and had 3 sons. After some difficult post-war times, he went into partnership with B. Berliner and opened a general store. A handful of other Jewish merchants began to arrive, often starting on their commercial path with a peddler's cart. In those early days, the need for rail service became obvious as cattle drives flowed into the area. Although planned for earlier arrival into the city, population had boomed to 3,000, by 1876, the railroad still had not arrived. Responding to an emergency time requirement, laborers and residents worked round the clock to prepare the road bed. Finally, on July 20th, 1876, T&P Engine 20 crept into town to the wild cheers of all the residents. Other Jewish arrivals in the last 2 decades of the 19th century included Joseph and Amanda Mayer from Indiana, who opened a liquor store on Houston Street, shown in this crowded scene taken in 1877. Fort Worth continued to grow, and by 1882, the population of the town had reached over 6,000. With streets being well laid out, the community acquired an air of permanence. Fort Worth was here to stay. During this period, more Jewish merchants came to the area, among the most successful of whom were the Washer and August brothers. Jacob Washer came to Fort Worth from Tennessee. His brother Nat followed within a month. Together, they opened up a general store on Houston selling hats, boots, and bandanas. Establishing themselves quickly, the business expanded to a substantial building by 1886. Speaking of their early days in Fort Worth, 50 years after their arrival, Nat Washer observed, "I got off at the corner of Main and 4th in a pouring rain, and as I landed in a mud puddle there, I mentally concluded that 1 year at most would give me my fill of Fort Worth and Texas. Alas, for human calculations and conclusions. I would not for the world exchange my residence in the Lone Star State for any earthly paradise some other state in the American Union might offer." As the Washers prospered, they became prominent in civic affairs of the city. Nat laid the cornerstone of the county courthouse in 1893. In 1899, Nat moved to San Antonio while Jake stayed in Fort Worth. With the continued growth of the business, it moved into increasingly larger buildings, by 1907 occupying the striking building shown here. Through their success, the Washer brothers were responsible for bringing other fine Jewish merchants to Fort Worth. Leopold August, hired by them to help expand their business, soon joined his brother Alphonse in a high-class clothing store under the name of A&L August Clothing Store. The August family, originating in Germany, had settled in New York for several years before coming to Fort Worth. As their clothing business prospered, they also made significant contributions to Fort Worth as a commercial center, seen in this bird's eye view from the late 1880s. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the August enterprise occupied a substantial part of a multi-story building. The performing arts were not ignored in Fort Worth from the city's relatively early years. By 1883, civic leaders formed a syndicate which built a 1,200-seat theater at 3rd and Commerce. This was the Fort Worth Opera House, managed by Henry Greenwald. No strangers to theatrical management, the Greenwalds managed theaters in Texas as early as 1867. In 1890, Henry bought the Opera House in Fort Worth, renamed it Greenwald's Opera House, and turned the management over to his brother Phil, shown here with his family. With one of the most modern theaters in the state, Philip brought in such luminaries as Sarah Bernhardt, Edwin Booth, Lillian Russell, and John Philip Sousa. But then misfortune struck and the theater was destroyed by fire. Construction of a new building was quickly undertaken, which local newspapers indicate was a center of culture and entertainment in Fort Worth for a number of years. Even after it was remodeled into a movie theater in 1936, it kept the spirit of the Greenwald days, leaving the backstage dressing rooms as they had been. Sam Rosen's story begins in Russia, where the young man, a boy really, decided he could no longer take the anti-Semitic abuse meted out by Russian teachers. He left his family to come to America in 1882, alone, working his way over on the boat. Preceded by his older brother Isaac, seen here in later years, Sam moved to Fort Worth in 1884 to work as a peddler, selling novelties as far west as El Paso. With some modest capital, he opened a dry goods store in downtown Fort Worth. When Swift and Armour meatpacking companies came to Fort Worth in 1902, Sam bought a tract of land for development west of the stockyards. His hunch was that packing house employees would prefer to build their own houses closer to work and avoid the long trek from the other side of the river. The area and Sam's development was to be known as Rosen Heights. At that time, to develop real estate outside of downtown required that some form of transportation be provided. The story of how Sam Rosen got his streetcar line built has some harrowing moments and some comical ones, but it was completed and provided more impetus for the development of Rosen Heights. Sam had other schemes to develop Rosen Heights. Initially, to interest people in building a house, he gave away lots. If the house was to be a big one, he threw in added inducements. He wanted fine homes built so that people would see it was a prospering neighborhood. Commenting on Sam's enterprise, a newspaper article noted that it was a success from start to finish and is now the most thickly settled section of that part of Fort Worth. In his own success, Sam Rosen and his family cared about the residents of Rosen Heights. He provided land for their church, paid water and power bills during the Depression, and never foreclosed on a house. Minnie Joseph's pot roast was one of the main reasons why Joseph's Cafe grew into an institution known throughout the country. Her husband, Sam, came from a family of amber cutters and arrived in America through Galveston at the age of 19 in 1882. Minnie, born in the Black Forest of Germany, entered the United States as a young child at the port of New Orleans. By 1887, Sam had opened his own grocery store and felt secure enough to marry Minnie, whose name, coincidentally, was also Joseph. Together, they opened a cafe at the corner of 9th and Houston. With a distinctive style and excellent food, their reputation grew, and the restaurant continued to be enlarged. Their family was also growing. Daughter May married Isidore Davidson of Palestine, Texas, whose father had emigrated from Germany in 1878. Sam and Minnie Joseph were remembered for more than their successful restaurant. A 1915 newspaper article reports on the enormous turkey with everything dinner that the Josephs provided for 135 poor boys and girls. Only Prohibition could mean the end of this Fort Worth institution, which closed its doors in 1929. B. Max Mell was instrumental in creating a market for a product that was plentiful, but that no one appreciated, as we'll soon see. Born in 1884 in Lithuania, he and his parents moved to America and settled in North Texas in 1893. By his mid-teens, he already had a desire to expand his coin collecting hobby. At this time, coin collecting was limited to a very small number of coin collectors. Max, however, recognized a market for coins that no one before him had seen, the non-collecting public. He set out to attract this untapped resource and started his own coin mail-order business from his home at night. His advertising woke up a sleeping public to coin collecting, and he became one of the most successful numismatists of all time. Max died in 1957, and his wife Ethel died in 1966. The story of the Sankarī family provides a fascinating evocation of the cross-currents of Jewish migration in the late 19th and early 20th century. Although Syria was the jumping-off point for the westward move that would take them to America, the family actually originated in North Africa and ended up in Syria with the armies of Napoleon. Charles Sankarī started life as Shahadi Johanna in Damascus, Syria, in 1892. After leaving Syria to avoid conscription in the Syrian army, Shahadi eventually made his way to the United States, following a detour to Argentina. At Ellis Island, he misunderstood a question about his name and responded with his occupation, the Arabic word Sankarī, which means artisan. To compound the error, the agent couldn't pronounce Shahadi and called him Charlie. Thus, Shahadi Johanna became Charles Sankarī, although he was later generally known as Shady. After a number of moves from New York to New England, where he peddled linens, then to several Texas cities, and eventually to Fort Worth in 1912, where he opened his first store that was to become Sankarī Brothers, for in the meantime his younger brothers had followed. The Syrian Jew, Shady Sankarī, married the young Polish Jew, Celia Horn, in 1918 when she was 17 years old. How did this combination come about in Fort Worth? Celia was born in Lublin in 1901, and her father, Eli Horn, came to Fort Worth in 1912. He became shamus of Congregation Ahavat Shalom and felt secure enough to send for Celia, whom he had left behind. Traveling by herself, the 13-year-old Celia spent 21 days on board the ship which departed Bremen, Germany. Her mother was not to come for another 6 years, and Celia remained in her father's care for a time. Charles and Celia met when she went to work for Sankarī Brothers in 1916. Married in 1918, shortly after which Charles entered the U.S. Army, leaving his young bride behind. Discharged in 1919, he realized his dream of attaining American citizenship soon after. Not too long after that, Brother Hyman married 14-year-old Genevieve Serur. Her arrival in Fort Worth was an interesting one, too, coming to visit her grandparents who had emigrated here from Egypt in 1916. Her mother, Esther Serur, longing to see her parents in Fort Worth, left her husband in Damascus, Syria, for what turned out to be an extended visit, culminating in Genevieve's wedding to Hyman. After long and active lives, building a successful business and families, Charles died in 1974, having been preceded by Hyman, who died in 1965. Meyer and Sarah Granus must have found the Fort Worth of 1905 to their liking when they arrived here 13 years after they had sailed past the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. That year, he acquired some metal beds and commented many years later, "That's how I went into the furniture business." The store he opened on North Main is still run by the original family. His 5 sons were active on school athletic teams of Northside High as they were growing up. All later played significant roles in the family business, in the professions, and in the community. Mose managed the store, rose high in the ranks of the Masons, and was president of Ahavas Shalom for 4 terms. Jake owned Granus Dry Goods and was also high in the ranks of the Masons. Twins Saul and David were practicing attorneys in Fort Worth for over 50 years. And David was recipient of Fort Worth's very first Man of the Year award in 1951. Abe was a highly respected Fort Worth physician throughout his long medical career. Like his brothers, Abe was very much involved in the Masonic order. Sister Ida, the only girl in the family, taught school for a time and married Adolph Cohn in 1929. Max Liddell arrived in Fort Worth soon after the turn of the century. He followed the path of other Jewish immigrants, becoming a peddler to farmers north of Fort Worth. Within 2 years, he graduated from a 1-horse wagon to the 2-horse model seen here. By 1915, he gave up peddling and opened a grocery store. He and his wife, Esther, had 2 children, Robert and Sylvia Liddell Wexler. The professions were well represented by the Jewish newcomers to Fort Worth. Theodore Mack was the first Jew to establish a law practice in Fort Worth, having arrived that year from Cincinnati, to which his parents had emigrated from Germany. He was also instrumental in the founding of Fort Worth's Reformed Temple, Bethel Congregation. With his son Henry, he established the law firm of Mack and Mack in 1925. After his death, his grandson Ted, following in the family tradition, became a partner in the firm in 1961. Fort Worth was getting on to a proper city when Abraham and Rachel Rosenthal arrived in 1908. He was the founder of the family meatpacking business. Before that, however, he was the hand-picked groom selected from a yeshiva in Königsberg, Germany, as being learned enough to be husband of Rachel Myers, daughter of Eli Myers. Ben, the 8th of Rosenthal's 11 children, went into the wholesale meat business. He founded Standard Meat Company and was eventually succeeded by his son Manny as president in 1946, shown here on the right. The story of White Rose Distributing Company is really the history of the drive and tenacity of Mickey Goldman, who was born in Poland and came to the United States as a young boy with his parents. His career in the liquor distributing business began with his purchase of 50 cases of beer, bought on credit and sold off the truck it came on. Years later, a successful entrepreneur with a family of 4 children, Mickey gave willingly of himself and the resources that had come his way through hard work to his temple and to the community. This presentation is necessarily brief, although there are innumerable fascinating stories to tell about the Jewish families who found their way to Fort Worth, settled here, and contributed to the growth of this community as they themselves made their way in the world of America and Texas. Sam Kruger's jewelry store, shown here around 1910, was also pictured in the recent encyclopedic American Jewish Album. We were represented in the arts also. His wife Fania had been involved in revolutionary politics in Tsarist Russia and was sent to the United States by her father to get her out of harm's way. She became a noted poet with several books of verse to her credit. Today, the Jewish community of Fort Worth and the surrounding area has an enriching diversity of organizations serving the cultural, educational, religious, charitable, and fundraising needs of the local and broader Jewish community. What we are today, who we are today, is derived from those incredibly brave people who ventured to America, to Texas, to Fort Worth. They came, as we have seen, from all over the old world, from Russia, from Poland, from the Middle East, from Germany. Some of them were laborers. Some of them started their own small businesses, some of which persist to this day as Fort Worth institutions. They started their families here, watched them begin to grow, and then began the eternal Jewish process of educating their children. They entered fully and enthusiastically into the process of Americanization, and some of the older children of families who had left Russia to avoid conscription nevertheless served in the U.S. Armed Forces as early as the First World War. During these years, they watched Fort Worth grow from cowtown to metropolis. As the community and country prospered, so too did many of them. The children entered into the social life, the Jewish community, and the community at large. In time, they saw their children marry and themselves enter into the social life of the community. In time to come, some of the earlier pioneering Jewish families gave tangible expressions of their thanks to this community for the haven it gave to them, to their families, to their fellow Jews, all of whom contributed in so many ways to the development of Fort Worth. They were not on the outside looking in, as was so often the case in the old world that they had left. They were an integral part of making this community what it is today. They are part of that mosaic of Jewish life that stretches back millennia in time, and that will continue to stretch forward to time immemorial.